Welcome to the Joe Monroe Show. Now, here's your host, Joe Monroe.
It's me, Joe Monroe, and thank you to everyone that viewed my very first episode of Roddy Piper Part 1. Now we're going to get into Roddy Piper Part 2. Now, I know I mentioned that there was only going to be 2 parts of the Roddy Piper story. However, rewatching They Live this past week, I decided no, I can't just do 10 to 15 minutes of this film then talk about the rest of his wrestling career. I can't do that to this film because this is, for one of the best John Carpenter films and one of my personal favorite films. But for two, just watching Piper and his acting ability, it blew my mind. I'm like, wow, actually focusing and paying attention to it into detail. It was just like, wow, this man was very underrated as an actor. Now, I know he did other films like Hell Comes to Frogtown. He did The Masked Saint, which as the evil promoter, which was actually one of his very last films that he made before he passed away. And also he made a film with wrestlers versus zombies, and it featured other wrestlers like Hacksaw Jim Duggan, Shane Douglas, and even Kurt Angle. That was a weird film. I can never go back on that. No, I need therapy after that film. All right. Anyways, let's get into it. So, They Live was actually based off a short story called 8 o'clock in the Morning, which was written by Ray Nelson. Now, it was also developed into a comic book as well. And John Carpenter, yes, that John Carpenter who written and directed Halloween, The Fog, Big Trouble in Little China. The list can go on and on. I mean, John Carpenter is a freaking legend, not just in film, but in the horror world. I mean, he's one of my inspirations. Come on. Mr. Carpenter, if you're watching this, don't mean to fanboy, but you're awesome. Keep it up, sir. So, with They Live, he acquired the rights to it and had so much to go off of. And he was just like, I kind of go H.P. Lovecraft with it. I wanted to develop kind of into my own story because the original story was set up kind of weird. A guy was hypnotized by hypnotists, and once he woke up, he realized everybody else was hypnotized by these aliens invading the world, and he had until 8 o'clock in the morning to stop it. That's basically how the story went. Now, personally, I haven't read the short story, nor have I read any of the comic books. So I'm not going to fully judge it harshly, but They Live was a lot better concept. So I'll give it a try, and I'll probably do a short video on Facebook or on YouTube or on my TikTok account and say, maybe it is pretty good. It could have been pretty good. But we'll get into more of that later. So the development of this film actually started where we left off at WrestleMania 3. That's where Carpenter was able to meet Roddy Piper. And Piper was just so honest and was just so, Roddy. And Carpenter was like, this guy really lived the main character, John Nada's life, which, we talked about in part 1, where he left home at 13 and was basically on the streets. That's how John Nada is. John Nada was a nomad, and so was Piper. So there was that reliability. But also, he went on to say, it looked like he actually experienced life, unlike other Hollywood actors. So he knew Piper was right for the job. Not only was he able to hire Piper, he was also able to hire Keith David. Now, Keith David also worked on the film The Thing. And Carpenter was just so impressed with his acting ability, he's like, I got a part for you. His name is Frank, and he's kind of the sidekick character to John Nada. Now, Frank is not just the run-of-the-mill sidekick. He's a badass. I'm going to cuss on this one because it's They Live. Come on. Now, with Frank and John Nada, they kind of have this brotherly love to him. Like the older sibling and the younger sibling. Especially when John's trying to show Frank the truth during the 7-minute fight scene that Piper was able to choreograph himself with Keith David. It was just chef's kiss. It was that good. And if you haven't watched this film like I suggested in part 1, go watch it now. Pause this video. Go watch They Live. Then come back and we'll get into the story. Did you watch it? Did you actually watch the movie? Did you? I don't believe you, but we're going to continue on. So, with They Live, production on this film was only 8 weeks. And out of those 8 weeks, 3 of them were spent on that specific fight scene, which John Carpenter went on to say was an incredible and grueling and funny fight, along the likes of John Wayne and Victor McLean. Is that how you say that? McLean? Is that how you say that? Thank you. That's how you say that. In the film The Quiet Man, which I've experienced because my grandfather was a big John Wayne fan. And between the 2 fight scenes, I can see it. It was very similar. And the music was composed by Alan Holworth and, of course, John Carpenter, because John Carpenter has composed most of his films, such as the incredible theme from Halloween and the music from Big Trouble in Little China. Another one of my favorite films. Maybe I'm just a John Carpenter mark. Has anybody... I'm just going to say it. I'm a John Carpenter mark. John, I love you, buddy. Keep doing what you're doing. I probably said that already, but I want to keep saying it throughout this video because, damn it, that man's a genius. Anyways, let's get into the film. So we start with John Nada, who I mentioned earlier is just a nomad. Now, he goes into an unemployment office, tries to look for work there, mentions he came from Denver, Colorado, where he worked there for 10 years until the town went under. Now, not only in America, but in other places in the world, that's still something that happens today. And it's really sad because you have people who are hardworking people, tried their best, and they have to travel kind of like Piper's character does, John. I mean, it blows my mind, even now thinking about it and watching this film. It's so relatable to this day, just with that. And I think that's probably one of the biggest draws, because especially in the blue collar community, John Nada is just such a relatable character until, we get into the aliens, which in this film, they're called ghouls. I just want to clarify that. I just learned that too. Yeah, ghouls. Thank you. They're called ghouls, not aliens. Let's move on. So John was able to find work at a construction job where he meets his future friend and sidekick, Frank. Frank goes on to say he is from Detroit, left his wife and children at home, hasn't seen them in 6 months, but is still able to send them money from the West Coast. I'm going to say this film's set in California, but is able to send money from the West Coast from the construction job back to them. Now, throughout the film, they stay in this little shanty town. I don't want to call it a shanty town because that's what it reminds me of. And across the street is this church where there's always choir practice going on. However, John Nada gets a little suspicious. Why, you ask? Because earlier in the film, as he was traveling, looking for work, in this same town, he's seen a pastor who was, if you've seen a street pastor, they talk about the end of times, but this was a little different. He was talking about people waking up. They're going to take over the world if we don't stop them, we don't do anything. And as this man is preaching, cops try to, stop him from preaching in public. And John thought that was a little strange, so he just continued on. But as they're watching, I don't see how the shantytown got a TV. That's another thing that bugged me. I guess they hooked up the power supply, don't know how. But as they're watching TV in this little shantytown, John stops and watches it with them. And he's just walking by because they start getting hacked. Now, at this in the 80s, there was the Max Headroom incident, and I think this is where this part of the film kind of gets inspiration from. I think, personally, that's kind of cool, because the Max Headroom thing was, to me, still hilarious. But back in the 80s, you got to think, it was very hard Unlike today. I mean, people can probably hack a TV station all day today and not have a problem out of it. But back then, it was unseen. And people freaked out. They were like, what in the world is this? What's going on? What do we do? Now we just get a good laugh out of it. But with the people who are trying to stop the invasion of the ghouls doing this, I think that was kind of sweet, because that references what happened in pop culture. And as John is watching this, he notices the same pastor is mouthing the words to what is being televised through the hack, until one of these men who wears a fisherman hat changes the channel. We'll get back to him later. The actor's name is Buck, and I love that man because this small role was perfect for him. But we'll get back to him a little later on in the film. So, the next day, John Nada was like, I wonder what's going on in the church. Because the guy that was kind of helping the little shanty town, giving them food and everything, was there until 4 o'clock in the morning. A little late for choir practice, wasn't it? That's the exact quote that John Nada told him. It's a little late for choir practice, wasn't it? And the guy just laughed and shrugged it off. So John, being curious, went into the church and come to realize the choir was nothing but a tape recording going over and over, just repeating gospel song after gospel song. And he thought it was hilarious until he turned around and noticed that there was just lab chemicals, sunglasses like this, and they were boxing them up. Now, as John is, snooping around, he notices a hole cut out, kind of like a hidden room. And that's where they had some of the boxes full of sunglasses at. And he was just like, oh, what in the heck what are they doing? And as he's closing this up, he turns around and there's that pastor. And the pastor's like, let me feel your face. Because he's blind. He can't really see him. So he's feeling his face. He's like, yeah, okay. God may have made me blind, but he hasn't taken my sight. And John was a little freaked out by this and immediately left before he can further investigate what's going on. So, being smart, was able to borrow binoculars from someone who lives in the shanty town as well and watch that church like a hawk. Now, later that night, the church got raided by police. Now, during this raid, they were burning down the church, trying to get everybody out of there. Luckily, everyone who was in that church was able to get out in time before anything could happen. Unfortunately, the shanty town by the church started getting demolished. Now, as everyone's trying to run away, John comes into this alleyway. I think it's just right over the hill from where the town was. And as he's going across this alleyway, he notices to the corner, police were beating up the guy who was in the hack video and also the pastor. And he was just shocked and awed by this. He's like, well, why are they beating these two innocent men up? The guy just hacked the feed, but why beat up the pastor? So John was able to escape with the same gentleman he borrowed the binoculars from. And it's just that realized moment when they're looking on in this abandoned building of what's going on. He was just taken back. He's like, why are they doing this? Like, what have these people done? What's so special about these sunglasses? Because it's definitely not drugs. That's what I thought it was. I mean, does the glasses have LSD in them? What's going on? I'm just guessing what he's thinking, because that's exactly what I'd be thinking. He's special, or what's going on? But John was able to return to the church and retrieve a box of these sunglasses, kind of similar to this. And as John came to another alleyway between buildings, he was able to get a pair out, put them on, and was able to hide the others in a trash can. Probably not the safest place in my mind, but hey, it works. And as he puts on the glasses, he starts seeing billboards. On the billboard signs, instead of advertisements, he starts seeing obey, marry and reproduce, no thinking, obey. Obey turns up a lot in this film, so that's why I said it twice. Even in magazines. I mean, same thing. Obey, listen, no thinking. I think this is where the political aspect of the film starts coming on. Because the ghouls, yeah, they're trying to mind control us. But people took this, even probably till this day, as a political standpoint. I mean, I was watching TikToks of this, and people's like, they've been telling us the truth since 1988. No, it's just a good psychological thriller that gets conspiracy theorists talking. I'm not going into that. But I think that's where a lot of people kind of compare and contrast the two. Hey, they make a good point, and maybe this is actually happening. I don't think ghouls are taking over. If so, Roddy Piper would have done taking care of them years ago. Anyways, continuing on with the story. So John Otter was able to go into this store, and of course he spots ghouls, and one of my favorite quotes, I was unable to find the clip. He was able to see this lady, and yeah, of course she's a ghoul, and he calls her something, or tells her something. Then he's like, looks at this one lady, he goes, you're okay. Her, real fucking ugly. And that's when, the lady, she's the first one to realize, hey, he can see my true face. So she starts talking into her watch, kind of like an Apple Watch. That's the best way I can say it. Starts talking into it, and the other ghouls that are in the store start walking towards John, and he's like, I don't like this. I don't like this one bit. And as he's looking around, he calls out another ghoul for being ugly, and that's when the police rush him. Now, the two police officers that do show up are also ghouls. So John, being frightened by this, shoots both and escapes with the gun belt and their weapons. Now, as he's on the run, he runs into the bank, and this is when we get the famous quote.
I have come here to chew bubblegum and kick gas. I'm all out of bubblegum.
I love that quote. That's one of my personal favorites of Piper. And I personally think Piper would have not only been a great actor or stunt coordinator because of the fight scene that we're about to see, but I think he probably would have written a pretty good script. As good as his book was, I think he probably would have been a great film writer. But let's continue on with the story. Now, John was able to escape after the bank incident with this lady named Holly. Now, Holly, I think, is like an executive producer of this news station, which she confesses to John in her home. And he's like, oh my goodness, they're broadcasting stuff through the TV. And this is probably one of the most odd stunts I've seen. Because as he's getting up to check the TV, she hits him over the head. There's this delay, like a really weird delay if you've seen the film. And he goes out the window. It's odd but hilarious, and it kind of works for the tone of the film. And anyways, that's just something that's kind of I thought I'd mention, because it's just like this awkward pause. Then he jumps out the window. But as he's rolling down the hill, Holly calls what we would think would be the police, and of course the police start showing up, and John, of course, survived. And he's like, if a random stranger is not going to believe me, I want to make have someone that I trust try to make them believe me. And during the process, he actually left his first pair of sunglasses at Holly's, which we'll get in just a second. So John was able to go back to the construction site to get Frank. He tells Frank to meet him in the same alleyway where he hid those boxes a few days ago. Now, when he gets there, he finds the trash cans are empty. And he realizes that there's a dump truck fixing to leave. And now, this is another hilarious scene in this film that I think Piper had way too much fun in, because it shows John sneaking into the garbage truck, getting the box of sunglasses, and getting hilariously dumped out of the garbage truck. And it just, if you watch the film, it's a hilarious moment. And I think Piper had just a little too much fun with this film. But so after that happened, Frank showed up. And this is when we see the infamous fight scene. Now, as I stated earlier, during the 8 weeks of production, 3 weeks of that was just them rehearsing and filming this specific scene, which Piper was able to take control of since he was a professional wrestler. And Keith David said it felt so long. I think it lasted a total maybe 7 minutes, 6.5, 7 minutes. And Keith David was like, it was the longest 7 minutes of my life, but we had fun with it. They would later recreate this fight scene in the video game Saints Row 4, which is the only video game that Piper was able to do a voiceover for. And I think that's kind of cool. I know a lot of people, John Gilbert, don't like video games, but I do, especially if they got Piper in them. So after the fight, John Nada was able to put a pair of sunglasses on Frank, and Frank was able to finally see the truth. And him realizing that John was not a nut, he's like, okay, what do we do? So they decide to hide out. Kind of like outlaws, kind of like Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid in this weird, ragged down hotel. And that's when they run into their old friend who was helping these people and also helped the shanty town. He said, hey, there's going to be a meeting. If you want to find out more about this, please come. So the two was able to come to the meeting. When they realized that they didn't need the glasses anymore, they now use contact lenses. And I kind of like this in the film. It just showed, how evolved, like, these people, I'll call them the rebels, were trying to, I'm a Star Wars fan, leave me alone. They were trying to expose the ghouls, and they were trying every which way sunglasses, but sunglasses kept giving people headaches, so they went with contact lenses. And at this time, that's when they swapped the sunglasses for the contact lenses. Personally, I think the sunglasses look cool, hence why I have a pair right now. But it's a good development within the story. Now, during the meeting, they're discussing on how to fully expose the ghouls. Which one comes to term, hey, we just need to hijack and find their main station where their main satellite's at, and it'll expose them all. And they were discussing news stations, and this is when Holly comes back into the picture with the sunglasses that John Nada left at her home. And as her and John were about to speak, she apologized for literally knocking him out the window onto a steep hill. The police raid started again. And this time, they just didn't demolish the place. They actually started killing civilians and people who were in this meeting. They wanted this wiped out. And just like the police officers that John Nada killed earlier in the film, these were also ghouls. Now, as they are escaping, Holly gets knocked down. But she was able to escape, and we won't see her until towards the end of the film. Now, John Nada and Frank were able to escape in an alleyway. Now, there was a person at the meeting who had the wristwatch. And come to find out, the wristwatch is not only a walkie-talkie or an Apple Watch type deal, it's also a transporter. And the guy was trying to figure out what to do it. So as Keith David is trying to mess with this thing, and the police started coming towards them, he was able to accidentally open a portal, which you had 10 seconds to jump in. I think 10 seconds was a little short, but who am I to judge? So they were both able to jump in this portal, and this portal led them to a television news station building. And here they see the ghouls and the elite of the human race having a meeting, letting them know, by such and such year, we'll have total dominance and total peace all over the world, and people will be rich and happy and blah, 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 blah. I mean, just giving them the bill of sale here. And as they are listening to this, we see Buck, the random man who I love, has finally become a rich man. I mean, hair slicked back, suit and everything, sipping on champagne, and he asked them, boys, I didn't know you've been recruited. First he asked about giving the tour, and then guys was like, yeah, give us a tour. Yeah, sure, we were recruited. And he's like, well, follow me. So he was able to show that they're not only able to transport within the world, within Earth, but they're also able to transport with other worlds too. And it come to find out, they have done this with multiple planets, and that they're going to continue to do this with multiple planets. because they are a controlling species. And he goes on to explain, boys, there's no such thing as the good guys or the bad guys anymore. It's them. They have control of the game, and we either play along, live a good life, or you've seen what happened at the shanty town. You just live a poor life, and they will probably end up killing you. So, of course, I won't call him Buck because I don't know his actual name in the film, but Buck was like, this is the dream, boys, and he was able to sneak them into the television, not really sneak them, but was able to show them the television news station which was broadcast. And they asked, is this the main station? He's like, oh yeah, the satellite's on the roof, which was a big mistake on his part, because when asking to go into the actual news room, he was about to convince two guards that he was friends with, and that's when John and Frank was able to eliminate them. And before they could eliminate Buck, he disappeared, which is the last time we will see this character, which is a shame, because I really like this character. Even though he's a sellout, it just shows the two sides of the human nature. Like, if this was happening, would you be with the flow, or would you try to work against the flow and try to get your freedom? I think that gelled pretty good in that scene alone. So as they're venturing in this building, they are able to find Holly. Now, during this time, as they're venturing, since they have contact lenses, they are able to tell apart who are human and who are ghouls. And in this scene, we see that most of the people that work at this television station are human. And I think there were a few ghouls, aside from the security guards, but, of course, they were able to eliminate them, get them out the way. But they were able to find Holly, who was there as a miracle. And as they were making their way up to the building, this is when we see, well, we really don't see Keith David's character, Frank, get killed. It was an off-screen kill, and I hated it. I got so mad. I'm like, come on! I was rooting for both of them to live. Now, as John Nada was able to find the main satellite, he was about to shoot it. Then Holly stood behind him and said, come with me. This is your last chance. And John ended up saying, the heck with it. Shoots her, shoots the satellite, and in the process of him shooting the satellite, gets killed by a sniper from a helicopter. But John was very successful. And the satellite blows up. The ghouls are exposed. And that is the end of the film. Now, to me, the end of this film, in my mind, left a whole other opening to a possible sequel. Now, in 2010, there were talks about doing a reboot. And personally, I don't think a reboot needs to be done. I think there just needs to be a follow-up sequel, because your main protagonist died in the original film. Let's just continue on with a brand new protagonist. Personally, who would I choose? Kind of like the new John Nada. That's a good question. Probably Chris Pratt. Yeah, Chris Pratt probably. Kind of gives that, because the way he did Star-Lord in Guardians of the Galaxy 3, perfect. Talks of a remake in 2010, and it had Carpenter producing the film, and had Matt Reeves directing and co-writing the script. And instead of doing a reboot, they decided to make it more close to the short story, which I explained earlier in the show. But after that, nothing was ever heard of, told. Honestly, I think, given how the world is in such tension today, and how many people actually watch this film today and love it, because it became a cult classic. When it first came out in 1988, it did make a huge box office. On a $3 million budget, they was able to make $15 million. But it got negative reviews by critical viewers. But it grew a cult following, I think, personally, right after that. Because a lot of people see this film as one of John Carpenter's greatest films he's made. And honestly, it's probably the best film Piper made. Me, I think if they remade it, John Carpenter 100% has to be involved. Kind of like with the new Halloween franchise. We don't talk about that third one. Just to be clear, when I get to talking about the Halloween films, Halloween Kills, No, it's not Halloween Kills. What is it? Is it Halloween Ends? Is that it? Man, I got so upset with that film, I don't even know the name of it. But when we get to that trilogy, the newer trilogy, I really don't want to talk about it. Do I have to talk about it? When are we talking about it? Closer to Halloween? Oh, bother. Okay. Well, there you go. There's a little sneak peek in October. We'll be talking about the Halloween franchise. Well, that concludes the show for They Live. If you haven't watched it, folks, I urge you 100% go watch this film. It's not only because it's my favorite film, one of my favorites. My favorite film of all time has to be Twister. We'll get on that probably in the next few weeks. But They Live is definitely in my top 5. And as I stated earlier, he made Hell Comes to Frogtown that same year. It's an alright film. I personally was like, it's okay. And then the same can go for his other films too. Except for The Masked Saint, he did great in that, I thought. But other than that, I just don't think the script writing was there with most of the films that he did. And with John Nada, he was just so relatable that you couldn't get no closer than that. So I still think he was an underrated actor. I think this film and pro wrestling at the time helped him get more public recognition. And I think if he was still alive today, I think he'd still be making films. Personally, after he retired from wrestling, I think he would still be making films to this day. But that's the end of part 2 of Roddy Piper. Join me next week for part 3, where we'll be getting into his Intercontinental title run and also his WCW run, which is the era I kind of started watching Piper. But until then, thank you. Have a wonderful day.
You've been listening to The Joe Monroe Show with Joe Monroe. Don't forget to like and subscribe.